My lady, the next witness is Mr. Kevin Courtney, and he will be asked questions by Miss Coon.
Thank you. Ms. Cohen, I apologise, I overran your time there. You don't take responsibility for it.
Thank you, my lady. May I please call Mr. Kevin Courtney?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Sorry to keep you waiting, Mr. Courtney.
Oh, that's absolutely fine. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. You have provided a witness statement for this module of the inquiry. I believe it is in front of you, and the reference that we have for it is INQ 000588135. I believe that witness statement has a number of signatories. They are Dr. Patrick Roach on behalf of the National Association of Schoolmasters Union of Women Teachers, or the NASUWT, Mr. Mike Short on behalf of Unison, Ms. Rachel Harrison on behalf of GMB, Mr. Dominic Hook on behalf of Unite, and of course your signature appears together with theirs, all dated the 18th of August. Would it be correct to say that all of those individuals on behalf of those unions have had input into that statement and that its contents were agreed by all of them?
Yes, we've all had input and agreed it.
Thank you. And are you satisfied that the contents of it are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. And is it right to say that you give your evidence today in your capacity as the former the former Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union and former member of the Executive Committee of the Trades Union Congress?
That's right. I retired from my role in August 2023, but I was Joint General Secretary along with Mary Boasted during the relevant period.
Thank you. And I understand that prior to having full-time roles within trade unions, your own work was as a teacher. Is that correct?
That's right. I have a degree in physics from Imperial College, then a PGC, and then I worked as a physics teacher, teaching up to A level and teaching lower school chemistry, biology, maths.
And in your witness statement, you have set out the detail and remit of each of the unions who contributed to the statement. Thank you for doing so. It means we won't need to go through those now. But I think I understand that collectively those unions represented about 760,000 teachers, 500,000 education support staff, and around 40,000 social workers. Does that sound right?
That sounds right. And it's a majority of people working in schools.
Thank you. And in terms of geographical reach, would it be accurate to say that during the pandemic, these unions operated across the UK, although I understand that the NEU has perhaps less of a presence in Scotland than the other unions? Is that fair?
Yes, we work with our sister union, the Education Institute of Scotland, in Scotland, so don't organise there ourselves, but we worked across the UK in collaboration with other unions.
Thank you. And Mr. Courtney, in your statement, you described some of the ways in which the unions worked to respond to the pandemic. Would it be fair to characterise that as having been focused on the provision of advice and guidance to members, engagement with schools and education authorities, advocacy and media engagement in respect of your members' concerns, and also direct engagement with governments of the UK?
Yes, direct engagement with governments of the UK, supporting them when we thought they were getting it right, as in the wider opening of schools in September 20 and in March 2020. Sometimes contesting the case with government when we thought they were getting the science wrong, as we did at other periods.
Yes, we will come to that.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney.
Yes.
In your statement, you also set out your assessment of the state of the education sector prior to the pandemic. This is a subject that the inquiry heard some evidence about last week, and you go into some detail about it in your statement. So we'll touch on it only briefly, if we may. I think, however, that your main point is that the education sector was not resilient at the time that the pandemic hit. And the factors that I think you identify are, taking it from the headlines of your statement, reductions in real-term funding for schools, structural changes through the establishment of multi-academy trusts, which changed the ways that local authorities coordinated the provision of education locally, challenges in teacher recruitment and retention, increases in teacher workloads, challenges in pupils' behaviour and engagement, and increasing numbers of children with special educational needs and disabilities. As I say, Mr. Courtney, you have included far more detail than that in your statement, but have I summarised that analysis correctly?
Yes, I think that with I would say that we were very concerned about the level of poverty facing children in our schools, and our members were reporting children that were coming to school hungry. There were schools that were washing the clothes of children and seeking to feed them. But the other points are completely irrelevant. The fact that school budgets had been cut also meant that class sizes were going up, and we had the highest class sizes in Europe. And I think that's relevant maybe later on in our discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Coming then to the pandemic, you remind us in your statement that schools remained open throughout the pandemic to vulnerable children and key worker children, and that teachers and support staff worked in schools to deliver that provision. Would you agree, Mr. Courtney, that that was essential work that they were doing, and that it was essential to keep schools open and available to the most vulnerable children?
Yes, absolutely. We always supported the fact that schools, even when they were closed to the vast majority, needed to be open to those children of key workers and vulnerable children. We encouraged our members to go to work in schools on a rota basis. Support staff were generally in school the whole time, working with smaller groups than perhaps usual, but they were in school the whole time, and it was vital that schools were open. Even though they were then closed to the vast majority, it was vital that they were there for the children that were with them.
Thank you. And similarly, you remind us that many teachers and support staff were working throughout to provide education even when children were at home, whether through live remote learning or, for example, producing homework packs. Would you agree that that was also essential work?
Absolutely essential. Took some getting used to at first, how to learn how to do the online teaching in the best possible way. And I think it's also worth saying that even when schools were open to most children, which was obviously welcome when that was able to happen, the teachers, as well as teaching the classes, the children in front of them, were also often preparing work for children who were at home because they were self-isolating, etc.
Yes, thank you. And Mr. Courtney, I'm not sure if you heard it because you may not have been in the hearing room, but we also heard a moment ago from Sir Hamid about how his schools and the Star Academies were operating as hubs for meeting wider needs of communities. And we've seen similar evidence in statements provided by other school leaders. Would you agree that many schools and staff actually took on a number of roles over and above those that were essential in order to meet the wider needs of their communities? I
absolutely would, and there was lots of evidence of that throughout the pandemic. Early stages, there were CDT teachers going in and making PPE, in small amounts to give to the NHS. But there were many instances where teachers were delivering resources to children at home and using the schools as that sort of resource hub.
Thank you. I'd like now to consider some of the concerns that union members had about the impact of the pandemic on their children and young people. We understand from your statement that the NEU conducted a survey of teacher, leader and support staff members who were working in schools between the 14th and the 21st of October. So during that period in autumn 2020 when most children were in school. Can we look please at INQ 000588135, which is your statement, paragraph 81. Thank you very much. You tell us here about what the survey highlighted. You say most members were reporting issues with pupils' concentration levels, an increase in fatigue, with a significant minority noting an increase in pupils' hunger and an increase in issues with clothing and hygiene. Later on in the paragraph, you say it is important to recognise that access to equipment did not only mean technology. Some of the country's poorest pupils were having to work from home without pens and books. You talk there about the poorest pupils. To be clear, were your members telling you that students were struggling with remote learning throughout, essentially because of poverty?
Yes. Obviously, that period, October, schools were more open. They were open to the majority of children at that point. I think I'm right. It's October 2020.
Yes.
So schools were open, though many children were still self-isolating. But yes, teachers were reporting, especially the effects of poverty, was having an impact on these questions. I don't know how much, teachers would tell us that, at first, obviously, many children didn't have a device or didn't have the data. But even when they did, you would have situations where you're trying to teach an online lesson and the child doesn't have a room of their own, doesn't have a space of their own. So there are other children trying to learn. There were cases where people would tell us that the child was in a room and their father, who had worked the night shift, was also in the room sleeping during the attempt to have an online lesson. So yes, poverty had a huge effect.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. We see there also mention about mental health and well-being. Are those concerns that were developing for your members over the course of the pandemic, or did they have them really at the outset?
We were describing mental health as a crisis before the pandemic. The absence of CAMS support, etc., and members reported that it was getting worse during the pandemic.
Thank you. With regard to this comment that we see about pupils' concentration levels and fatigue, you may be aware that in the evidence from schools to this inquiry, school leaders have not generally identified long COVID as a factor that they were concerned about themselves. Long COVID symptoms can include fatigue and a lack of concentration. Is that something that your members were concerned about during the pandemic?
I don't think that was something that came up in that survey in October 2020, and there would have been less knowledge, talk about long COVID at that point, I think. But certainly it's been something that members have raised with us, both about staff developing long COVID symptoms, but also about their students as well. Obviously, and thankfully, a minority in both cases, but that can still be thousands of people.
Thank you. We can take that down now. We were speaking there about points that your members raised in 2020, but you also exhibited to your statement the report from the NEU's annual survey of its members in 2023, which gives us some insight into enduring concerns of your members. And we read from that as well as having ongoing concerns about mental health and well-being, your members also expressed concern about behaviour and motivation in the year after the pandemic, and they appear to, in that report, to link that to the pandemic. What were your members concerned about in that respect, and why did they attribute this to the pandemic?
Yeah. So, as I said, I retired in August 2023, but I still feel current with these questions. And our members report as a commonplace, really, that behaviour has deteriorated amongst some children. And our members definitely put that down to the periods of school closure, the lack of socialisation for younger children who weren't able to go to nursery settings, and that being an issue for other children at older ages, yeah.
Thank you. Coming on then to questions about education recovery.
Okay.
We know from your statement that teachers and leaders reported consistently that children's learning had been impacted profoundly by the disruption to their learning experience during the pandemic. And in your statement, you are critical of the government's decision not to fully implement the recommendations of the Recovery Commissioner, Sir Kevin Collins. This decision is something that Her Ladyship has not yet heard about and will hear more about in due course. But in outline, what did your members consider were the consequences for pupils of the decision not to implement that advice?
There's a context to all of this, isn't there? We'd had to close schools essentially because of the risk to community, not because of the direct risk to pupils. There were some children that got long COVID, but we knew very early on that it wasn't children that were at risk fundamentally from COVID, it was older age groups. But schools had to be closed for some time, I think maybe longer than they needed to be because of bad management by the government. But children were paying the price, even though they weren't at risk. And we see all of these effects that are reported now about still having increased absence, these increased problems of behaviour, the increased mental health questions. And I think it's vital that the government should be investing in this generation of children. So Boris Johnson appointed Sir Kevin Collins in February of 21. And we supported that. We thought it was a rare, good decision from the government to appoint Sir Kevin Collins. We welcomed his report, which was calling for more time in schools, exciting activities going on in schools. He'd put a price tag on it of £15 billion, which we saw as an investment in our children. And the government just went nowhere near it, offered less than a tenth of that. And he resigned in the summer of 21. That, I think, has been a betrayal of the children of this country who paid that price, even though they weren't fundamentally the ones at risk from the COVID pandemic. It's a betrayal of the children of this country. And we should not just have been doing that, but we should have been investing in youth clubs, in play centres, in the child mental health services. All those things should have been happening. And they should be happening now. We should be reducing childhood poverty. We should be reducing class sizes in schools. All those things are possible, and it's what we should be doing for this generation of children.
Thank you very much, Mr. Courtney. You began that answer by talking about decisions to open schools and close schools and the timing of those decisions, and I'd now like to turn to ask you questions about the position that the education unions took on those issues. We know that on the 18th of March, of course, it was announced that schools would close to most children in order, as you have said, to slow the spread of the virus. And I think it's right that that is something that the unions had been advocating for and supported at the time. Is that right?
Yes, we thought it should have been done a bit sooner. We'd called for it in a public letter from the NEU, that is on the 14th of March, so not much sooner. But when you're in an epidemic, when you're in an exponential growth phase, then even a few days make a difference. And we think we think that closure should have happened sooner, and that if it had, the period of closure might well have been less.
We know that a step was taken towards a partial reopening after that closure decision when guidance was published on the 12th of May, setting out a proposal for partial reopening to take place on the 1st of June.
Yeah.
And I think it's right that the NEU did not support reopening schools on the 1st of June and was advocating for schools to remain closed for longer. Is that a position, Mr. Courtney, that would have been arrived at through any sort of formal ballot or vote among your members?
No, we were discussing with our executive around these questions, but we were reporting to the executive what we understood of the science of these matters. And we had published by then our 5 tests for safer school opening, which were about reducing community transmission, and we didn't think that the government could meet those 5 tests, and we think they were scientifically supported, couldn't meet them by the 1st of June. We thought that there should be a further 2 weeks period of maintaining the period of restricted opening of the schools being closed to the vast majority of children. We thought there should be a further 2 weeks of that in order that cases could fall further, and then in order that the government could have in place test, track and isolate methods. And I think that's a scientifically supported, I mean, for me, that's still the right position. We were judging it at the time on what we understood of the science, but looking back, I still think that was the correct position.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Just on the point of the views of members or the views of the NEU executive, the inquiry heard evidence this morning from Sir John Coles of United Learning, and I think that you have had the opportunity to read his statement, and you will have seen that one of the things he says is that he did not feel that the views being articulated by the teaching unions reflected the view being expressed by our staff. Could that be right, Mr. Courtney? Is it possible that some teachers and school leaders may have had different views to the NEU's leaders about whether schools should reopen on the 1st of June?
Well, I'm sure it's true that some of them would have had different views to the NEU, yes. But I do feel confident that we were representing the views of the vast majority of our members, and we tested it in a number of ways. We were having regular meetings with our members via Zoom, via other mass participation events. And I think it's worthwhile saying that across the course of the pandemic, we recruited thousands more school workplace representatives and tens of thousands more members. That's not a sign of a union that's out of touch with its members. There were times during the pandemic, and I think it's worth saying this, when we could see there were differences of opinion amongst members, and we were trying to take this into account. So, for example, is it all right for me to give this? For example, during the period of partial closure of society in November 2020, when Boris Johnson went for that, do we call that the second lockdown, the half lockdown, that period of 4 weeks in November, we called at that point for secondary schools to be included in that period of partial closure.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. If I may, I'm just going to pause you there and just bring us back to June 2020, just so that we can take the chronology in the right order. Okay,
I was just going to say that gave an example of where members pushed back on our position from 2 different directions. So we were engaged with members who had different opinions.
Thank you very much. taking us back then to June and the NEU's position on the partial reopening on the 1st of June. Sir John tells us in his statement, and he told us this morning, that he spent some time engaging with you directly on this topic. And I'd like to look, please, at a document on this before we pause for a break. It is at INQ 000649526. Thank you very much. This is the letter that Sir John sent to yourself and Mary Bowstead, whom you referenced earlier, on the 16th of May 2020. This was sent just a few days after the publication of the Department for Education guidance I referenced on the 12th of May. If we can look, please, halfway down page 2 at the paragraph that begins our approach. Thank you. We see that Sir John was explaining that the approach in United Learning Schools was to work through in every school a very detailed plan as to how wider opening can be organised, following the principles in the guidance and working through all the specific issues of the building and the staffing. And then he includes some detail about that, and lower down he writes, please, 2 paragraphs below, however, it is important in doing this planning properly and safely, taking account of all concerns and finding the best solutions, that heads involve staff in the planning. I'm pleased to say that colleagues across our schools have been heavily involved in planning so far. However, I think your advice to your members not to speak to leaders about planning places both leaders and other teachers in a very difficult position and is counterproductive in risking making it harder to produce the best plan. Mr. Courtney, had that been your advice to your members, and if it had, do you consider that it was a constructive approach to planning for safe reopening?
It was a position we held for about a week while we were getting materials ready with other unions to go out, and then we did encourage engagement. So I do think it was, I think it's being mischaracterised here. I do think it was responsible. We wanted to put in front of our members the best understanding of science, the best ways we could engage about safe reopening. So for a short period, we said, don't engage this week, but we'll come back to it. And then we were encouraging engagement. And indeed, John went on to talk this morning about some engagement he'd had from reps.
This would have been a week where time was really of the essence, and safety planning was a day-by-day imperative. Why would you want to delay that for a week?
In order to have the best possible advice on safety there to go out to our reps. During the pandemic, we, at various occasions, issued safety checklists, which we issued sometimes on our own, more often with other unions, that we sent out to our reps. We got them to go talk to head teachers about them in order to put things in place. You have to bear in mind that John is the chief executive of the United Learning Trust, and we had, across the period running up to the pandemic, we'd had this process of academisation going on in our schools, and there was much weaker management, in much less central capacity in many areas. So if you were a standalone academy, your relevant body was central government. In the ULT, they had their central team. They could produce these sorts of guidance. If you were a standalone academy, you couldn't produce them. If you were in a school in a local authority, your relevant body was the local authority, but it had been denuded by budget cuts, and there was much less capacity there. So partly we felt that we were filling a void there in order to produce those checklists, etc., that our members could use with head teachers. So I do think it was a sensible thing for us to push for that, to get that material out to members.
I see, thank you. My lady, I think that may be a convenient moment for a break.
Just before we break, just pursuing that point, Mr. Courtney, I do understand, obviously, that you want to have as much information available as possible before you advise your members on what to do. But I'm still not pursuing the question Ms. Cohn asked you, I'm still not following why your members couldn't at least engage with the leaders of the various institutions just to see what might be done pending receipt of the advice from you.
We very quickly were at that position, but we had been, this was one of the points where we had been contesting with the government, where we thought the government was definitely getting the science wrong. And I'm convinced that we were right about that, and we wanted to make sure that we could situate all that in the advice that we were giving. So that we wanted to take that bit of time to get that right. And we also wanted to we were pressing the government at that moment to say that June the 1st was going to be too soon. And, you know, on the 29th of May, there were 4 very senior members of SAGE, not independent SAGE, 29th of May, 4 very senior members of SAGE who said in a coordinated intervention that it was wrong to open schools on the 1st of June. They were Peter Horby from NERVTAG, Jeremy Farrer from the Wellcome Institute, Professor John Edmonds from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Callum Semple, who's a professor of childhood health and outbreak medicine. And they had a series of interventions that were all saying we need to get cases lower in order to have test, track and isolate up and running. Now, that was the position that we held at the time, and this is confirmed by, you know, by the course of events. We would have been better as a society if the government had delayed in those measures in order to get test, track and isolate set up and running. I guess there is a bit of hindsight, though, that does give me a bit of pause, because I think the government actually never managed to get test, track and trace and isolate running. But if they had, then we could have avoided those second peaks, I think.
Thank you very much. We'll break now, and I shall return at 10 to, and I promise to move the curtains to stop the sun coming in.
My lady, this session will resume with the evidence of Mr. Courtney.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dobbin. Ms. Coombe.
Thank you, my lady. Thank you, Mr. Courtney. We were on the subject of the June 2020 partial reopening, and we had just looked at Sir John's letter to you of the 16th of May. If we can look now, please, at INQ 000651602, page 82 of that, paragraph 235. Thank you very much. Sir John says in his witness statement, and he's discussing here, having sent you that letter, that he subsequently met Mary and Kevin to discuss the points made in my letter and how we might work together. The entrenched position of the unions, however, made any meaningful engagement impossible. Despite recognising in private that children and young people were being harmed by the extended school closure and the low risk the virus presented to them and to most members of staff, the NEU refused to acknowledge this publicly or to encourage its members to take a positive view of the return to limited in-person teaching. Mr. Courtney, if we may, I would like to take that in stages. Is it right that when you met with Sir John, you recognised that children and young people were being harmed by extended school closure?
Yes, that would certainly be right.
Thank you. And is it right that you also recognised when you met with him that the virus presented a low risk to children and to most members of staff?
Yes, and we were acknowledging that in public as well.
And perhaps you would not agree that he says your position was entrenched and that made meaningful engagement impossible?
No, I don't agree with that. I mean, I've known John a long time. I knew him when he was in the department and then had many engagements while he was the chief executive of ULT. And I think he's a fantastic chief executive of a multi-academy trust, but he's wrong on this question. We had positions. You could call them entrenched positions if you like, but I think that's a mischaracterization in the context. We were talking about the best way to manage the virus based on our understanding of the science in the way that would, if it was managed properly, would minimize the amount of school closure time. So we were advocating for our 5 tests around this period, which were about essentially getting cases low enough that test, track and trace and isolate could work.
I see.
That's what we were advocating for.
Thank you. Could we look now, please, at INQ 000649155? This is a letter that the NEU wrote to the Secretary of State for Education on the 21st of May. And this was a pre-action protocol letter about the decision to reopen on the 1st of June. And it's right, isn't it, that that's the formal first step of challenging the government in court about a decision?
Yes, we'd been trying to get data from the government informally, if you like, and we couldn't, they weren't providing us with data, so we sent a pre-action letter.
Thank you. Yes, and if I can help you on that point, if we look, please, at page 21 of this letter, we can see at paragraph 56 that what the NEU were asking for was all scientific advice that the government had relied on in reaching this decision. Is that right?
Yes.
And to help us understand how matters had reached the stage of threatening to adjudicate this decision, can we look, please, at paragraph 27 of this letter, which is at page 8. We see from paragraph 27 that the NEU had met with the Department for Education through stakeholder meetings on the 24th of April, the 1st of May, the 7th of May, and the 12th of May. And if we can look, please, at paragraph 28, we see from that you yourself, Mr. Courtney, had met with the Secretary of State for Education on the 14th and 31st of March, I beg your pardon, that should be the 24th and 31st of March, the 7th, 14th, 21st, and 28th of April, and the 6th, 12th, and 19th of May. And we won't go there, but we know from elsewhere in the letter that the NEU was additionally invited to a separate meeting with SAGE, attended by Sir Patrick Vallance and Sir Chris Whitty, on the 14th of May. So, Mr. Courtney, I count that to be 14 meetings between the NEU and the Department for Education, Secretary of State, or SAGE, between the 24th and the 19th of May, 24th of March and the 19th of May. Is it right, though, that you consider that those meetings were not adequate engagement with the union during this period?
Well, they didn't provide us with the data that we needed to understand the proposal to open schools on the 1st of June. If we were to support it, we'd want the data to show to our members to explain why it was a good thing. If it was the wrong thing, as we believed it was, we wanted to look at the data to see that. I mean, I think your witness, John Coles, this morning told you that he was involved in meetings but didn't feel that he was getting the data that he needed to represent the case. We were in that same position. We weren't getting the data from that. I mean, on one of the occasions when I met with Gavin Williamson, he told me, this was a wider stakeholder meeting, he told me that I sounded just like Dominic Cummings because I was always talking about the data as Dominic Cummings was. I mean, the data is important, and I think the Secretary of State should have been interested in the data as well.
Thank you. Can we look back then at that letter before claim? It is INQ 000649155. Sorry, I should characterise it as a pre-action protocol letter.
Yeah.
And if we can look towards the back of that, page 22 of it, at paragraph 60 and 61, we see there that your position was essentially that in the absence of having that data, the NEU needed to receive it and then needed 5 days from receipt to consider it. It sought an undertaking that the government would not make any final decision about whether to reopen schools until the NEU had that opportunity, and an undertaking that the government would not require, direct or advise schools to reopen from the 1st of June until a meaningful opportunity to consider it had taken place. Mr. Courtney, you've been very clear that what you wanted was the data so that you could understand whether, in your view, reopening would create an increase in transmissions. Mm-hmm. But at this stage in the pandemic, I'm sure that you will recall that there was emerging concern that school closures were proving harmful to children. You've just accepted that you accepted that in your meeting with Sir John. There was rising concern about hidden harms of abuse, neglect, domestic violence, and that the lack of education was increasing the disadvantage gap between the poorest students and others. Taking a step back and understanding what you say about the risk of community transmission, do you think it was in children's interests at this stage for the NEU to be prioritising sight of data over returning to face-to-face education for children?
I mean, what was in children's interest was managing the pandemic properly, managing it in line with the best science. If the government had followed our recommendation and closed schools earlier in March, then that period of school closure would have been less. If they'd followed our recommendation in June and got cases down and got test, track and trace working, then there would have been less school closures in the rest of the year. So it's not, I think your characterisation is wrong. It's not us taking the data versus the interests of children. We wanted the data in the best interests of children. We were always seeking to manage the pandemic in the best way, and and that would allow you to have schools more open. We met with the Danish Teachers Union around this time and talked to them about the fact that they'd managed to open their schools much earlier. And we were interested in that. But what was behind that was that their government had closed down society much sooner. By doing that, had far less cases and far less deaths. They had much smaller class sizes, so they were able to open in a much safer way. There are better ways of running the pandemic than the way that our government did.
Thank you. I'm going to pause there again and just come back to refocus on our government's approach. If we can look, please, at INQ 000649156. This is the Department for Education's response to your pre-action protocol letter on Monday, the 25th of May. If we can look, please, at page 3 of that, specifically paragraph 10, we see that the letter provided you with links to the advice of SAGE and others that had been published the previous Friday, the 22nd of May. You can see the list of that evidence there. And if we go over the page, please, to look at paragraph 11, we see the response was that the department's view was that this would provide a large degree of transparency as to the scientific advice which the government is taking into account. Mr. Courtney, presuming that you had had a good look at that evidence that had been published the previous Friday, and understanding that you say you disagreed with it, would you accept that it was nonetheless reasonable for the government to be relying on the expert advice it had received?
The government should rely on expert advice, yes. We were pleased to get this letter from Andrew McCulley because, as I said, we weren't getting responses to our informal requests for data. The data it refers to here is publicly available data that we already had, the publication of the SAGE data on the 22nd. But it wasn't full, was it? We know. I mean, I know from reading for this evidence session that Sir Patrick Vallance, in his COVID diary, wrote in June 2020 that the DfE had been unwilling to ask SAGE for information about childhood school transmission, because if they asked SAGE for that, then it would be in the public domain. And, you know, this letter refers us to SAGE, saying that SAGE was supportive of, implying that SAGE would be supportive of the wider opening on the 1st of June. But as I said in an earlier answer, on the 29th of May, in an astonishing intervention from 4 senior members of SAGE, they disagreed with that. They said that we haven't got cases down low enough, we can't get test, track and trace running, this isn't the right way. And one of those 4 gentlemen that I spoke about said that an extra 2 weeks of closure now will be much less damaging to children than a further full closure because of a second peak down the road. And so that's the balance that you have to look for. Yes. Not whether we're asking for data, but what is the correct way to manage these school closures in order to minimise the total period of school closure? Well,
the question, Mr. Courtney, is about whether it is reasonable to rely on the official advice that the government had received. And I want to see if we can shortcut this slightly, because we were hearing from Sir John earlier today about further correspondence with NEU representatives in which they had cited the opinion of the BMA and the opinion of independent SAGE. And indeed, I think in some of your own correspondence, you cite independent SAGE or the BMA. And one of the points that Sir John makes, and I wonder how you would respond to that, is that it isn't right to write correspondence or to advocate for a position relying only on the advice of the scientists with whom you agree, and not citing the advice of scientists who the government had reasonably relied on. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that's right. You should look at the science in the round. But I would say, in response to it, it is unreasonable of government, of the DfE, not to ask SAGE to look at the evidence of childhood school transmission of the virus, as Sir Patrick Vallance said that they didn't. And it's unreasonable to ignore the position that these leading people like Jeremy Farrar from the Wellcome Institute also have. And sometimes there's a contest over the science. But in my opinion, the government was just dead keen on getting schools open, no matter what the effect on the virus. And I think you see that in the rest, you see that in at other points during the management of the pandemic, when we did support opening, as in September 2020, but the government didn't manage to get test, track and trace in place then either.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Just before we leave this point about the situation in England in June, I just want to slightly unpick something you said earlier and ensure I understand it. Do you agree that there is a distinction between whether or not opening schools might have an effect on community transmission rates on the one hand, and on the other hand, whether or not opening schools was safe for children and teachers themselves? Do you agree that that's a distinction?
Absolutely. There is a very clear distinction between the two. We were following, I mean, at some stages, at early stages, you couldn't be sure what quite that distinction was. But it very quickly became clear that children were at low risk from COVID. That didn't mean no risk, and many thousands of children have ended up with long COVID in ways that I think might have been avoided if the government had better mitigations in place. And that's also true for staff. But there is a very clear distinction, and our actions were about community transmission.
Yes.
But that's because of the feedback they have on whether schools can be open or not.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. So if we read in NEU correspondence, it is not safe to open schools on the 1st of June, we should read into that because of community transition rather than because of the effect on children and teachers. Is that right?
Yeah, I think those questions of nomenclature, you could look back on those and think about those harder. But
some might say it's more than nomenclature, because if you're writing to teachers to say something isn't safe, that is potentially quite an alarming...
Well, I was just going to make the point that Boris Johnson talked about schools being unsafe when he called for them to close in January 2021. But yes, our point was community transmission is the question that we need to be looking at. That does, but if you reduce community transmission, then you do also improve the safety of individual members of staff from long COVID. You improve their safety of any relatives that they have that are clinically extremely vulnerable. You increase the safety of some members who are older and slightly more vulnerable. So you do increase safety of teachers and other staff in schools. But fundamentally, it was about community transmission, which would, though, allow you to open schools for less periods of, it would allow you to have schools open more of the time if you manage the pandemic properly, which our government failed to do.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to come now, if I may, to the situation as it was developing in Wales during this same period. And I think it may help if I set out just a little context to these questions. We know that in late May, the NEU and other education unions were engaging with the Welsh Government about the Welsh Government's plans for a wider reopening of schools in Wales. And my lady will hear more about this in due course from Mr. Mark Drakeford. But in summary, the proposal that the Welsh Government made to the NEU and others on the 26th of May was that the summer term of 2020 could finish early, on the 22nd of June, allowing for a holiday over the last week of June and all of July, but that the autumn term would then begin early at the start of August, when there were likely to be lower transmission rates, allowing pupils to receive more face-to-face education before an anticipated second wave in the autumn of 2020, which might force more closures. And the detail of that, my lady, is set out in the statement that Miss Kirsty Williams provided for Module 2B, but I don't think for our purposes we need to go there. Just for the transcript, it's INQ 000362237 at paragraph 184. But I'd like Mr. Courtney to ask you, please, instead to look at the note of the union's engagement with that proposal. That is at INQ 000607980. Thank you. This is a note of a meeting on the 29th of May, when the education unions gathered to provide their feedback on the Welsh Government's proposal that I've just described. We see at the top of this document a number of representatives from the Welsh Government were present, including the Minister for Education, and we see a number of union representatives were present, including David Evans of the National Education Union. And we see at the foot of that Steve Davies, and pausing there, I should have said he was identified as a director of the Welsh Education Directorate, thanking members for their feedback at short notice and concluded that moving the summer term dates was not a viable option following feedback from members. Steve expressed there was a strong desire for learners to get some kind of contact with their education settings before September, and that somebody would set out options for the group. Then over the page, we see a list of further options. I won't go through them all, but they are essentially tweaks to the term dates in order to achieve the objective of having children in school at some point over the summer. And we see below, if we may, under main comments provided by the unions, an emphasis on the required scientific evidence, clear and quick guidance, and we see there is still a concern regarding contractual issues if an extra week is added before the summer term. Mr. Courtney, a few questions arise. First, would you agree that what the Welsh Government were doing here was engaging with the unions in an attempt to provide more face-to-face teaching time for children, whilst transmission rates were low over summer, in line with scientific advice that they had had?
I should say before answering that this isn't something that I was aware of before preparing for this. I had no direct personal involvement in it at the time, although I've read all the documentation and had a chance to talk with the unions in Wales. So I do feel able to engage and answer the questions.
Thank you.
And the idea of raising this particular suggestion of bringing the holiday period forward by 4 weeks, that is not a bad thing to raise. And she certainly was engaging with the unions when she raised it, which was the question that you asked.
Thank you. And is it correct, as noted here from this minute, that on the 29th of May, the unions opposed the first proposal that the Welsh Government made to shorten the summer term and start the autumn term early?
Yeah. I mean, I've actually have a slightly different timescale from yours. I think it was raised on the 25th of May rather than the 26th of May. But there are differences in the documents. But it was raised on either that Monday or the Tuesday, the 25th or the 26th. The unions raised a set of questions about it, and there are a number of questions that it would occur to you to think about. If you're bringing the end of term forward by a month to the 22nd of June, then from the 29th of May, that's only 3 weeks away. So you're bringing the end of term forward. That means that any events that you have, any work that you have to do of getting children ready for, getting ready for the end of term, or any work you have to do of preparing for the next term, is suddenly shortened by 4 weeks.
And do you consider that that is why the unions opposed that plan?
Well, that's not my point. No, my point is that there are those questions and there are contractual questions. And then the Welsh Government asked them to consult a light touch consultation with their members. So between the 25th or the 26th and the 29th, they had that light touch consultation with their members. And members didn't think it was a good idea. So it was raised on the 25th of May and dropped by the Welsh Government on the 29th of May. That's a very short timescale to have any sort of discussion about something of the scale of this, and there would be lots of questions that members would have about how you could get ready for those changes.
Thank you. If I may, then we'll carry on, and then we'll come back at the end to the merits of that position. If we can look, please, at INQ 000350747. We see the announcement that Ms Kirsty Williams, Education Secretary, eventually made on the 3rd of June 2020. And it's not apparent from this document, but instead of announcing the restructured summer term that she had hoped to, she instead announced something of a plan B, and it was that schools stay open for an extra week in the summer term ending the 27th of July, and that week's holiday would be redistributed to the autumn term. In this statement, what I want to draw attention to is that she says, during this time, I would expect schools to use this period too. And we see a focus here on the health and well-being of learners and staff, a check-in with learners to support them in their preparedness, test operations for the autumn term, and to build confidence of families. Are those objectives, Mr Courtney, objectives that the unions would have supported?
Those are worthy objectives.
Thank you. Can we look then at INQ 000615673? This is the note of the meeting following that announcement, at which the Welsh Government discussed this plan with the union representatives on the 9th of June. And we can see at page 2 the response of the unions to this. Under Hugh Owen requested feedback from all representatives on the general feeling of members, and we have their main concern was the lack of guidance and information at the time of the announcement. Extra week an issue, consternation among members, some already booked holidays, have worked through lockdown, including Easter and half-term holidays, and feel they have fulfilled their contractual duty. We won't go through all of those bullet points, but perhaps we'll give you an opportunity to take a moment to look at them. Because I want to ask you, Mr. Courtney, this list is about logistical concerns and practical concerns of union members. It's not about transmission. It's not about safety. Is that an accurate reflection of why the unions opposed this second proposal of the Welsh Government to provide more face-to-face time for pupils?
I wasn't in the meetings, as I said earlier, so these are minutes of the meeting, and I haven't had a chance to discuss all of that in depth with the unions in Wales. What I understood happened was that the first proposal was raised on the 25th of May. Then the Wales Government dropped it on the 29th of May. So that was the proposal to bring the holidays forward by 4 weeks. Then on the 29th of May, they raised the prospect of putting the term back by 1 week instead. And then they asked unions again to consult with their members. And I thought it was slightly shorter than this period. I thought they were asked on the 29th and then asked to come back the following Monday. This is a week the following Monday. So I can't be certain about those particular dates. But those sorts of questions would have come up from members.
Well, Mr. Courtney, with respect, they don't appear to be questions. They appear to be objections, reasons not to do this. Is that right?
There are some question marks in there, but yes, members would have come up with objections, if you like. I mean, that would happen. You know, people would presented with something that is presented very quickly. You don't have a long time to respond to it. You're thinking on your feet about these questions, and some members would have said, and why shouldn't they? They've been working really hard. They've been in schools working on rotas. They've been teaching online. The support staff have been in school the whole time working with children. And if they've got a holiday booked, why wouldn't they raise that as an issue?
So,
but this is quite a small change that the government is producing on one level, and the effects, the positive effects of it, if there were positive effects, and I think you would have to model that and think that through. That it's 1 week, and people didn't want to make that change.
Well,
and
Mr.
so,
Courtney, if
so
I may.
when the unions then represented the views of their members, that was the response that's what members had said to them.
Yes. Mr. Courtney, if I may, we discussed earlier your members' concerns about the impact on children and young people of lockdown and of school closures, including, as we've said, the disadvantage gap, the impact on mental health and well-being, and you agreed a moment ago that those objectives of Ms Williams in seeking to alter those term dates were worthy objectives. And yet, here we see the unions objecting to two plans, and in Mr Drakeford's words, and I can give the reference in a moment, the reason for doing that was because of the primacy of contractual arrangements. What would you say, Mr Courtney, to the suggestion that the unions acted here in members' interests, but that position was one that wasn't in children's best interests?
I don't think that's a fair characterisation of these sorts of proposals raised with the very little time that they were presented. You know, to produce something saying we're going to bring the end of term forward by 4 weeks, and to produce that at such a place that it's 3 weeks before that period, that's not seriously thought through. The second proposal of extending the end of term, there are worthy objectives, but would they be met is a different question. Would those worthy objectives be met by this extension of a week? And I think many of our members would have doubted that they would be met in that sort of way, and then they have their other objections to it. This is part of the interaction between stakeholder groups. And I must say, on behalf of the Welsh unions, when I spoke to them, they thought that they had a very good relationship with Welsh Government during the pandemic. They were quite taken aback by the position that Kirsty and then Vaughan Gethin and then Mark Drakeford have taken in this. And they were working hard to get social partnership running, to make schools as open as they could be, to make them as safe as they could be. And they engaged throughout the pandemic in that sort of thinking with Welsh Government. They thought their relationship was quite good. They're disappointed by these statements from the government and the attacks on the unions that have come from those people. And they don't think they're worthy or valid in these situations.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. My lady, I said a moment ago I would give the reference for Mr. Drakeford's statement, and I didn't. Mr. Courtney, I don't think I need to take you there, but just for the record, it's INQ 000588203, and it's paragraph 16 of that. I'd like to move forward now in time, if I may, to the beginning of January 2021. Mr. Courtney, of course, you know that this was during a period when schools had closed again to most children. And again, the two key policies for mitigation were first, allowing vulnerable children to attend school, and second, facilitating the remote education of children who could not be in school. And we discussed earlier your agreement with my proposal that that was essential work throughout the pandemic. Can we look, please, now at INQ 000652055? This is a letter written by Unison, so not your union, Mr. Courtney, but one of the signatories to your statement, to the Secretary of State for Education in England on the 22nd of January 2021. We see from the first line that this was a letter written on behalf of staff working in special schools. Can we please read from the second sentence of the third paragraph? We agree that the most vulnerable children... Thank you. The letter states that the union agrees that the most vulnerable children should be in school, but says the wider definition of vulnerable seen in this current lockdown has led to a significant increase in numbers of pupils attending special schools. This is putting support staff and pupils in these schools at risk and undermining the benefits of reducing community transition. We ask the government to implement urgent additional measures for special schools, including, and at the first bullet point, they request urgent review of the guidance as to who should be a vulnerable learner. They say, in particular, the guidance should make clear that it may not be possible for every student with an education, health and care plan to attend their special school or alternative provision setting. And at the next bullet point, asking schools to carry out individual risk assessments of each pupil, with the emphasis on only attending the site where a pupil's circumstances mean that it is genuinely not possible for them to be educated at home. Would you agree, Mr. Courtney, that that letter appears to be aiming to reduce the numbers of children with education, health and care plans that were attending special schools?
I think you have to think about the situation leading up to this letter being sent and to read down a bit further in it as well. Because what I take this letter as being about fundamentally is the request for vaccination of people who work in special schools. And you'll see that in the fourth bullet point there.
Yes.
Cases had been rising dramatically, the Kent variant in the run-up to December. Then there was the period, the lost Christmas. Then there was the question of Gavin Williamson saying he was going to open all schools or all schools outside London on January the 4th, schools opening and then closing the very same day when Boris Johnson said they were unsafe to be opened because there were vectors of transmission. So that was the biggest message that was then being given out in society, was that schools were unsafe because of vectors of transmission. Now, we were fighting for that understanding of community transmission. But if you were working in a special school, you knew that your school had always had far more children in than proportionately than primary and secondary schools. You also knew that in very many special schools, your chance of social distancing was very dramatically lower. I mean, in some cases, you're dealing with children who are, you're dealing with their bodily fluids in some cases in some sorts of special schools.
Mr. Courtney, I'm sorry. The question was whether you agree that this letter appears to be aiming to reduce the number of children. I think in setting that context, perhaps you're agreeing that that is the aim of this letter. Would that be right?
Okay, but I think that context is important. important, Unison would have been facing very many calls from members saying, we're not sure that we're safe in this circumstance. Yes. There were, that will have been the position that Unison was facing. So they sent a letter, but as I say, the fourth bullet point here, they were asking for vaccination of their members working in special schools. There had been priority vaccination of people working in the NHS, absolutely rightly. The number of staff working in special schools is a very small component of the staff working in our schools altogether. And certainly, these were amongst the people who were had least protection from the virus in society. Certainly people in the NHS were in that category.
Mr. Courtney, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We have had a module on vaccination, which included vaccination priority. I want to ask you in this question about, and I think I understand from your answer that you're also identifying at the very difficult balance between those wider concerns about transmission, community transmission, vaccine rollout, but on this occasion, the individual interests of these children with education, health and care plans who may have wanted to attend their special schools. Do you think that on this occasion, this union got the balance right between those children's interests and those wider contextual interests that you've identified?
I mean, I think if the staff had been vaccinated, then all these questions would have faded away. So I think Unison was properly trying to address that balance of risks, the balance between staff and teachers, and were suggesting a way forward that resolved them.
Thank you. Can we look now, please, at INQ 000350774? This is a letter from the same period, but sent by the NSUWT Cymru to Mr. Mark Drakeford on the 12th of January 2021. So again, not your union, but a signatory to your witness statement. And in terms of context, this letter was written shortly after the Welsh Government had shared draft guidance with the NASUWT in which schools were required to provide live lessons to pupils, required rather than invited. And if we look, please, at the middle paragraph on page 2, we see the union's response to this. There was no consultation over the changes to the guidance, and the implication of the change is, of course, that teachers throughout Wales can now be directed to undertake live streaming. This arbitrary change was in direct conflict with the purported aims of the Welsh Government to engage the social partnership. And we see at the bottom the objection that it would lead to a damaging increase in stress and workload on teachers in Wales. And again, in terms of wider context, the Welsh Government's position was that this move to mandating some live streaming of lessons would ensure that there was equality of provision for students in Wales, so going some way towards that disadvantage gap that we've discussed. Wouldn't this intervention from the NASUWT have meant that not all children would have been able to access live streamed lessons? And wouldn't that have been detrimental for disadvantaged children?
I mean, I should say again that I had no knowledge of this before preparing for this and wasn't directly involved in it. But I've read this letter, and the NASUWT in it state absolutely that they support synchronous live learning. The content of this letter is about a relationship between union and management where there have been consensual changes and where a change has been made without proper consultation. And they're asking for it to be reasserted that consultation is happening in these circumstances. I think that's a proper thing for a union to raise. It isn't saying that people shouldn't be engaged in synchronous live learning, which was by then absolutely commonplace across the profession, and members of all unions engaging in that.
Mr. Courtney, in that answer, and I think in some of your previous answers, you've emphasised the importance of consultation and the difficulty of things happening quickly. You talked about the very short period of consultation when we were looking at the July term time issue in Wales. And as you say, that is something reflected in this letter. More generally, what would you say to the suggestion that during a pandemic, governments were having to make policy at breakneck speed, not always able to consult as much as they would have liked?
I mean, clearly during a pandemic, there are times when you have to make decisions quickly. But you should try and make the right decision. And sometimes, I mean, for example, around the question of the opening of schools in January 2021, the way the government behaved created enormous stress amongst teachers and parents in schools. And that was not proper. That wasn't decision-making being made in an urgent way because it had to be made in an urgent way. It was decision-making. They had the minutes of SAGE of December the 18th, 2020, which said that you could not open schools and have the R rate below 1, and they just delayed and delayed and delayed before they made the right decision. So yes, some decisions have to be made quickly, and you should still try and engage staff and unions with them. Some decisions have to be made quickly. Other decisions can be planned better than they have been planned, and there's no reason not to consult with unions about changes to contracts during a pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. There's just one document I want to trouble you with before I come to your reflections. That is INQ 000649175. I beg your pardon, that's the wrong reference. That's not the document I want to ask you to look at. I'm so sorry. Can we look, please, at INQ 000587899? This is, thank you very much. Sure. This is the witness statement of Sir Daniel Moynihan, who is a head teacher by profession and CEO of the Harris Federation, a large multi-academy trust comprising 55 academies. I think you've had the opportunity to consider this, and I want to ask you, please, about paragraph 129, which is at page 21. And here, Sir Daniel is discussing some of the challenges that his schools faced in delivering remote learning. And he says unhelpful challenges included the National Education Union regional representatives at one point demanding that Harris teachers teaching lessons online at home should be allowed to turn their cameras off for reasons of privacy. This was clearly not something we were able to agree to given the disruption to learning. Mr. Courtney, is that a position that you recognise? And if so, wouldn't that have made the experience of children learning effectively from a blank screen very difficult?
Well, that wasn't a position of the National Union, and that was never something that we advocated for, that these lessons should be taught with cameras off. So this is something raised by one of our reps, or maybe two of our reps. I don't know the further context, and nor do I know at what point from this paragraph here, at what point that was raised. Now, it is certainly true that at the beginning of the lockdown in March 2020, when teachers were learning and understanding how to work with Teams classrooms or Zoom classrooms, that there would have been a lot less knowledge of how to do that well. So, the thing that you can do of having a false background behind you would not be something that everybody would be aware of. So some of them may have thought they were showing their home when they're teaching online so I don't know what the context of this is. I don't know when it was raised. I don't know what that context is. It wasn't a position of the National Union, and something's been raised with them, and he hasn't agreed with it.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. I'd like to turn now to your reflections and your overall recommendations for the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney, overall, the TUC advocates, I think, rigorous planning for infection prevention and control in schools in the future. And I think you have seen the witness statement of Professor Viner, from whom we'll hear later in these hearings. I don't think I need to ask you to go there, but I will read you what he says.
I've read it, yeah.
Thank you. I will read everybody else what it says then.
Yeah.
It says, I have reservations about whether the recommendation of permission for schools to implement stringent and evidence-supported control strategies early in an outbreak situation and to prioritise in-person learning is workable and realistic in terms of individual schools introducing stringent control strategies. I absolutely support keeping schools open to prioritise in-person learning, but each pandemic will differ and there may not be a need for control measures in schools. You, of course, Mr. Courtney, are very familiar with the complexity of the school estate and of the costs implications of improving that estate, and also of all the competing demands on the education budget in England and indeed across the UK. So there are some complex factors at play here. On the one hand, practicality. On the other, uncertainty about the nature of a future pandemic, and also costs. What do you say then is a proportionate way to square that circle in terms of preparing schools for infection prevention and control in the future?
Well, I mean, if we agree that closing schools was a necessity in this pandemic for at least some time, but that it has had very serious consequences for young people as a result of that, then we should be prepared to invest to try and stop that happening in the future. I think we let children down by not investing pre-pandemic in smaller class sizes, etc. But on this question of the school estate, there are a number of other pressures on the school estate at the moment. We should be, and the government, the DFE is doing work on how do you get schools ready for net zero, for the climate demands. There is the rack concrete, there is the asbestos that's in many schools. There is a need for a thoroughgoing programme of work in schools, part of which should be improving the ventilation and the air filtration in schools, which would not only help potentially in many pandemics. I mean, I recognise what Russell Viner says, that in some pandemics you might not need to close schools. In others, there might be even more need to close schools if what we'd been facing was not COVID-19, but the Spanish flu of 1918, which did affect children much more than adults. Then you would definitely have had to take measures. So having ventilation, filtration in place in schools would be a real benefit, I think. Every year around cold and flu, it would be a benefit in the summer, in the summer of 2022, when children lost time in schools because it was too hot and the schools didn't have enough ventilation and they had to close because it was too hot. So investing in ventilation, I would think, should be a massive priority for the government.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. I think in connection with that you have also seen in your evidence bundle the evidence of Miss Susan Ackland-Hood, Permanent Secretary for the Department for Education, and within that, her summary of the department's work to improve air quality in schools. Do we take it from your answer that you approve of that and that you think that is a valuable step?
I do. I think it should have been worked on at earlier stages during the pandemic, because, we supported the opening of schools in September 2020 and in March 2020. But it would have been better if we'd had, following March 2020, it would have been much better if there were mitigations in place like ventilation and mask wearing, so that we didn't have so many children who had to have time off because they had COVID. And there was a huge amount of pupil absence even after schools opened. So it would have been better to invest early on that. You
said opening in March 2020. I think you meant March 21. Yes,
sorry, yeah.
No problem. Turning then to broader reflections and recommendations, and again, you set these out in some detail in your statement. I think I understand that many of your recommendations are essentially targeted at improving the overall resilience. So you mentioned a moment ago smaller class sizes, for example. You will know that the terms of reference for this inquiry are quite narrowly limited to measures that can be taken to mitigate the impact of a pandemic. Mm-hmm. Is there anything over and above infection prevention and control and broader resilience that we have discussed that you would suggest my lady should consider?
Well, I really do think class size comes into that. As I was trying to say earlier about the situation in Denmark, which did open schools much earlier than we did. Part of the reason they were able to do that was that class sizes were lower in the first place. Then they went back, first of all, with half class sizes, and that meant very small numbers compared with the bubbles that we had in this country. They also had much better space standards. So I do think that smaller class sizes is a part of pandemic preparedness. And right now, pupil numbers in primary schools are falling because of demographic changes. If we could, there's a way of not closing schools, but instead of having class sizes that are smaller, that would be pandemic preparedness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Courtney. Please finish your answer.
I also think that dealing with childhood poverty is a part of pandemic preparedness. The fact that so many children couldn't access at first, didn't have devices, didn't have data, don't have rooms to do their work in, that leads to those differences in outcomes that happen by wealth doing what we can to reduce childhood poverty and reduce childhood inequality is part of pandemic preparedness. But so is that investment in ventilation, air filtration, those sorts of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Courtney. My lady, those are my questions. Do you have any questions?
No, I don't. Thank you very much, Ms. Cohen. Thank you very much, Mr. Courtney, for the help that you've given to the inquiry and the help that your colleagues have also given. I appreciate there's some difficult areas of tension between various bodies. So thank you for your trying to assist us in the way that you have. Very grateful.